We can look at the same game in the extensive form, and actually that will not tell us anything different because it's still a simultaneous move game, but it will show us the interaction in a more interesting manner. In this case, we can again go with he, choosing between IPL and watching movie, and then she gets to choose between IPL and watching movie, except of course they move simultaneously. So, there is a dotted line between the two nodes where she has to make a decision. So, just like before, we can use the concept of Nash equilibrium, but we can see it better in the sense that obviously if both he were to watch IPL and she were to watch IPL, they would be at a Nash equilibrium, and similarly if they were both going to watch a movie, that would also comprise another Nash equilibrium. So, the previous game that we looked at is also known as the battle of the sexes, and actually this is one example of a larger class of games called coordination games. We can look at one such game and we can see what will be the result. Let's think about a situation, say there are Indian firms and Chinese firms and you are producing mobile phones. Now, for mobile phones to work, they have to adopt certain communication standards and certain technology standards, otherwise the phones made by Indian firms will not be useful in China and the Chinese phones would not be useful in India. So, it would be useful if both the Indians and the Chinese use the same standards, then both set of firms would be able to access each other's markets. Now, on the other hand, if the Indian firms would have a certain advantage in using Indian standards and making sure that the Chinese firms also adopted Indian standards. And similarly, the Chinese would have a similar interest in making sure that Indian firms adopted Chinese standards. So, now let us look at the game. So, again if both Indians and Chinese were to adopt Indian standards, then the payoffs are 100 and 80. 100 for the Indians because after all they are getting to stick to their own standards, but at the same time they are getting access to the Chinese market. On the other hand, if the Chinese and the Indians adopt Chinese standards, the payoffs are reversed. Now, the Chinese get access to Indian market while keeping their own standard. What happens if the Indian firms adopt Indian standards and the Chinese adopt Chinese standards? Well, they both get 50 each, which just shows things are not that bad, but now neither of them has access to the other's market. On the other hand, if Indian firms were to adopt Chinese standards and Chinese firms were to adopt Indian standards, then the payoffs would be 20 and 20. Obviously, this is the worst possible situation. What are the Nash equilibria for this game? Can it be possible for Indian firms to adopt Indian standards and Chinese firms to adopt Chinese standards? Or in other words, is 50-50 a Nash equilibrium? Well, if Chinese firms were to adopt Chinese standards, what would Indian firms do? Indian firms would rather adopt Chinese standards. So, obviously, the situation where Indian firms adopt Indian standards and Chinese firms adopt Chinese standards is not a Nash equilibrium. Similarly, Indian firms adopting Chinese standards and Chinese firms adopting Indian standards is also not a Nash equilibrium. You can check very easily. What about both of them adopting Indian standards? Now, suppose the two sets of firms find themselves in a situation where they are adopted Indian standards. Would either set of firms want to move away from this particular situation? Let's check. Suppose the Chinese firms have adopted the Indian standards. What would the Indians want to do? they would like to be where they are with Indian standards. Suppose the Indian firms choose the Indian standard, and what would the Chinese like to do? Would they like to move away to the Chinese standard? No, in which case they would only make 50. So they would like to remain where they are, that is, in a situation where both sets of firms have chosen the Indian standards. So choosing the Indian standard by both Chinese and Indian firms is a Nash equilibrium. Similarly, both sets of firms choosing Chinese standards is also a Nash equilibrium. Which equilibrium outcome is more likely? Well, we cannot say from the information that you have been given. But it is nevertheless another example of a coordination game.